Days after being shot, Donald Trump becomes the Republican presidential nominee. His rival, President Joe Biden, is isolating with COVID-19. More senior Democrats are urging him to quit the election race. How critical a week has this been for both men? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. When he took the stage at the Republican Party convention, perhaps the only sign Donald Trump had been shot less than a week ago was the patch on his ear. His keynote address lasted about the length of a feature film. But even Hollywood screenwriters would struggle to come up with a plot to reflect the drama that's been unfolding. The week has delivered a contrast of somewhat dramatic proportions, too, for Trump's election rival, President Joe Biden. As he isolates with COVID-19, a growing number of senior Democratic figures is urging him to abandon his bid for a second term. So how big a week has this been, and what impact will it have on the November election? Will Biden stay or will he go? And if he does quit, who will replace him? We'll be analyzing all this with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
An acceptance speech, longer than any made at a US party convention. Donald Trump formally accepts the Republican nomination to run for president. Some supporters say the assassination attempt has left him a changed man, as he called for unity.
To every citizen, whether you're a young or old man or woman, Democrat, Republican or independent, black or white, Asian or Hispanic, I extend to you a hand of loyalty and of friendship.
Physically, despite the bandage on his ear, he appears the same. And some critics say his speech, referring to an invasion of immigrants and saying he can stop a third world war, was classic Trump. The events of the past week have boosted his popularity among his support base and kept him dominating US media coverage. A contrasting week for Joe Biden. The US president is isolating at home with COVID-19. Until now, Biden has remained steadfast he will not quit his campaign for re-election. But with this latest health setback, adding to mounting questions about his age and capabilities, and more gaffes, such as referring to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin as the black man.
Secretary of Defense, the black man.
Democrats at the highest level are pushing for him to stand aside. Reports say senior party members, including former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, have privately told Biden he should step down. And behind closed doors, Democrats have reportedly asked former President Barack Obama for guidance. There isn't much time left to find an alternative candidate. The party convention begins in a month. Some analysts say Biden's running mate is in pole position.
Most likely it would be the vice president, Kamala Harris. And I think if that were to happen, two things would happen. First, you would hear a huge sigh of relief around the country from Democrats who would be just thankful that we didn't have to go through this with the president. And then second, I think there would be genuine excitement and motivation on behalf of the vice president.
A week of differing fortunes for the two candidates, and one that may prove a critical point in the race for the American presidency. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's now bring in our guests. From Crested Butte in Colorado, we're joined by John Neffinger, who's the former communications director of the Democratic National Committee. In Sandy Springs, Georgia, is Janelle King, who's a former deputy state director at the Republican Party in Georgia. And from Chicago, we have with us James Warren, who's the executive editor of NewsGuard. That's a media fact-checking ratings organization. And he's also a former Washington bureau chief of the Chicago Tribune. Thanks for your time with us on Inside Story. We appreciate it. Janelle, I'll start with you, and we'll start with Trump. So on the assassination attempt, he claimed in his speech that it was divine intervention which saved him. I mean, that type of speech plays well with his constituency. But do you think that he missed an opportunity to speak to swing voters?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of swing voters who are also believers and Christians as well. So I don't think he missed opportunity at all. And to say that it's divine intervention, I mean, you have to consider the fact that the bullet missed him by a quarter of an inch. And if he had not turned his head to look at the chart that he had placed on the screen, he would not be with us. And if he had turned his head any further to the right, he would not be with us. So I think it's safe to say that there was certainly divine intervention there. I don't think that that will deter independent voters. I think independent voters were excited to hear a lot of his policy positions. I think they understood the state of this country and where we are. And considering that we have such a weak president in the White House at this time, I don't think independent voters are lost on the fact that we need someone who's strong, who can withstand some of those challenges, particularly an assassination attempt.
All right, hang on a sec, because he did start off kind of with a unifying tone, unifying speech, but then really it devolved into a lot of grievances. He said some misrepresentations. He sometimes came across as unhinged. But to win, again, he's got to reach beyond his base. He's got to reach those swing voters and the suburban mothers. So in that speech, did he really show some of the weaknesses that still persist in him as president?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask. Perception is leading a lot of this discussion. The fact of the matter is he stated things that he had witnessed. He stated things that happened to be fact. There are a lot of migrants who have poured into this country without having any type of legal paperwork or legal representation. I think that is a true statement. A lot of the things that he did mention are things that we really are facing. When you think about the state of this economy financially, we are struggling. Families are really, really struggling. You have grandmas that are splitting pills because they can't take the right amount of dosage because they don't have the finances to re-up. You're talking about mothers who are struggling to buy diapers. I mean, we are really living in a tough time right now. So I think you have to kind of push past your perceptions and start to listen to the fact that he's stating things that people are actually going through.
I mean, it's not really a perception, though, is it? I'm going to bring in my other two guests, but we have to be clear. It's not a perception here. I mean, there were a number of fact checkers that actually fact checked his speech. But let me bring in John. Was this Trump different to the Trump that accepted the party's nomination back in 2016, do you think?
For about a half an hour, yes. For the first half an hour, we saw he read from the teleprompter, which was loaded with this fascinating, riveting story, right, of his near-death experience. And then we heard some new things from Donald Trump, some tones of reconciliation. But, I'm very sympathetic to the folks who prepared Donald Trump for this speech. You do your best. You try and set him up for success. You try and, contain their instincts and channel all of their wonderful energies in wonderful directions. But what happened after that first half an hour was he went back to regular Donald Trump. And in fact, it was not just sort of vintage entertaining Donald Trump. It was not the best version of Donald Trump. It was long, to the point where people on the floor of the convention were reported saying, "Wrap it up, Donald." After that first half an hour, there was an hour of that regular stuff, to the point where this was the longest convention acceptance speech in history. And so he went on and on and on, which I guess shows great stamina. But he was not high energy. He was not particularly entertaining. He was sort of listless through a lot of that. And what I think in a bigger picture, what this means is we've seen hints of this. Obviously, the first debate was catastrophic for Joe Biden. It may end his political career yet. We're about to find that out. But in parallel, people also didn't like Donald Trump's performance at the first debate. And we'll see how they react to this now. But the Democratic strategy has always been that when people tune back into Donald Trump, when they see him again, and when they see this new Project 2025 darker version of Donald Trump, that the Democrats are going to be fine, even with a sort of an older placeholder.
Okay, hang on a second, John. Let's talk about the Democrats because, let's talk about the Democrats. I mean, because this Republican convention, many people say, really put the Republicans' unity on display. And if you contrast that with what's happening to the divisions that are really roiling the Democrats, where do you think things sit right now with the Democratic Party? I mean, this is an incredibly dramatic moment, is it not?
It absolutely is. And I will tell you, for myself and all my Democratic friends and allies, this has been gut-wrenching ever since the debate. And, one day it's like, oh my God, Joe's going to go. And then, no, he's going to hang on and we're going to have to deal with this. And it's been back and forth and back and forth. Where we seem to be right now, the latest reports are showing that really there are a lot of forces slowly, sometimes too publicly for my taste. It's slightly humiliating to see all these people publicly call for him to stand down. But it is looking like Joe Biden is less likely to be the Democratic nominee. And what that means is that at the end of the day, the Republicans may be the party saddled with the low energy old guy, whereas the Democrats would have somebody new and exciting.
Okay, James, let's bring you in. Look, the Chicago Convention is a month away. President Joe Biden's reelection bid hanging in the balance, really. I mean, more and more Democrats asking him to kind of privately, some publicly telling him to just step aside. Is it a matter of when, not if, for Biden, do you think? Or do you think that the Democrats still think that he can go up against Trump?
Well, the most important stuff right now is we don't really know, all the media reports aside, what he is being told by his family and his inner circle of 2 or 3 longtime aides. We simply don't know that, and we don't know whether the stubbornness he has showed is going to prevail. But I think we have a pretty good sense that the next week is going to be critical. The convention's about a month away. And it's, 50 years ago, at almost the same time that Richard Nixon, then president, in the midst of the Watergate scandal, was only persuaded to resign the presidency. In fact, the very next day, after a trip to the White House by 3 very, very, very prominent Republicans, 1 senator and 2 congressmen of the time. Now, will something of the same happen now? One doesn't know. But a bottom line is that even though Kamala Harris might succeed him, and we might conceivably have a contested convention here in Chicago in a month, the underlying polling realities, and we're in the middle of the summer and we still have a few months, are not good for the Democrats. There are 3 states they must win. That's the only way they can win the presidency. And those are around here, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. They are trailing in all those. And there are 6 or 7 states. Remember, it's an electoral system, 6 or 7 states that Biden won against Trump that he is also trailing in. And when you look at polling, if you believe it, of the relative strength of Kamala Harris versus Biden when it comes to a 1-to-1 match against Trump, it's about the same. They both have underlying weaknesses at this point.
I'm glad you brought up that polling about Kamala, because I wanted to ask you about that. But just one more question for you, James. I mean, just give us sort of an overview about how challenging this has been for the Democrats to deal with. If you take, for example, someone like the former President Barack Obama, who has reportedly been listening to many of the Democratic concerns, he has to weigh sort of the mounting opposition to President Biden, continuing his campaign with his loyalty to his former vice president. So how delicate a moment is this for Democrats?
Well, I mean, just think of something that might play out in one's own family with an elderly uncle or a dad, and you want to take the car keys away and say, you're not up to driving anymore. I mean, it's incredibly sensitive. And one slight qualm I might have with the setup piece about that referenced all the media attention that Trump has been receiving, I think to the chagrin of the Democrats, most of the media attention in this country the last month or so has been on Joe Biden and his health. And that's something that's momentum on the Republicans' behalf that they're going to have to somehow quickly change, which is why I think the next week, Biden has to make that big decision about whether to continue. And the Democrats can't be naive about the hurdles that, regardless of whether it's Harris or somebody else, the hurdles that they still confront in these last few months.
Janelle, would the Republicans be worried over another candidate? I mean, take, for example, we've mentioned Kamala Harris, for example. Do you think that Harris could be Donald Trump?
So absolutely not. The Republicans are not worried about Kamala Harris. And I think it shows that the Democrat Party is not speaking to their base, because Black men are not going to vote for Kamala Harris. considering the fact that she has such a record of putting them in prison. So I definitely think that we will be hopeful to have Kamala Harris. It will be hopeful to have Gavin Newsom, because when you look at the state of California, if the whole country wants the entire country to look like California, then he'll win. But I certainly don't see that happening as well. We're not concerned about who the Democrats put forth. I think the fact that they're showing that they have to switch out the person that they have in place now shows that the party itself is not ready to move forward. So I think the American people will clearly see that whether they have issues with both parties, both candidates, either way, they understand that at this point, we're picking capability over everything. And President Trump is showing that he has the capability to do the job.
John, unlike a president's resignation, though, which automatically, of course, promotes the vice president, Biden potentially, we don't know yet, but if he were to drop out of the race, does not necessarily mean that Harris will be at the top of that ticket, correct? I mean, how would a new nominee be chosen? I wonder if you can just explain that for our international viewers that may not be aware of this.
Absolutely. So the formal process is that the delegates who were chosen to represent Joe Biden in the Democratic primary will get together at the convention, unless something happens sooner, and there have been conversations about that. They'll get together at the convention and they will vote to name the Democratic nominee. What could happen is Joe Biden could say, you know what, I'm going to hang it up and I release my delegates to vote for whomever they choose. Or he could say, I recommend to my delegates that they should vote for my vice president, Kamala Harris. So we'll see what he does. We don't know yet which way that goes. There have been a lot of conversations over the last week with Democrats, with Hollywood, with all kinds of people talking about how to set up a mini primary. People call it a blitz primary. They call it choose your champion. To basically to respond to the public. The idea would be, if we get a fresh start in this moment, I mean, Janelle is not wrong that this is not a good look for the Democrats, that we have to switch horses at this point. But on the other hand, it is true that we knew months ago that the American people were not excited about a Trump versus Biden rematch. And so if the Democrats have an opportunity to be responsive to that feeling and the Republicans are not, we could end up with something like almost like a reality TV show crossed with mini debates or forums. And then we would have a couple of weeks of getting to know the new, half dozen or so.
So how quickly do you think a nominee could be chosen?
I mean, look, a nominee is going to be chosen at the convention. The question is what happens between now and then. Does Joe Biden stick it out? Does Joe Biden say, go vote for Kamala? In which case, I think that might do it. That's probably his decision to make.
James, if it's just handed to Kamala, my apologies, let me just jump in there. James, if it's just handed over to Kamala and you remove that element of competition, is that a good thing for the Democratic Party?
I mean, I think the quicker, the better you can make a decision because of the formidable electoral challenges you have in the states that you are trailing in. And just as important will be who you would pick as a number two and whether he or she could help you in this, these three key states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It's an electoral system. Can one come up with a tandem, whether it's Harris at the top or not, who can somehow reverse the momentum that's in play right now and benefits the Republicans?
And talk to us about the momentum, James. You mentioned it a short time ago, but I wonder if you can just elaborate a little bit more about that polling that you were talking about between Harris and Trump, for example. Is there a big difference between her and Biden versus Trump?
No, not a whole lot. The Washington Post did a survey of 11 national polls, and in 4 of them, Biden does slightly better than Harris. In 4 of them, Harris does slightly better than Biden. And in the final 3, it's sort of a wash. But the most important thing is that they're all a couple of percentage points behind Trump at this point.
Okay, Janelle, if a party fails to rally behind someone, and I'm not here just talking about the Democrats, whether it happens with the Republicans as well, if they fail to rally behind someone, what happens then? And how likely is that scenario?
I mean, I think it's actually very likely. I know it was just mentioned that, we saw early on that a majority of our voters was not supporting either one of them. I believe it's to the tune of 70% of voters said that they didn't want President Trump or President Biden. And I do think that this is a message that is being sent to people like us, as strategists, people that are working behind the scenes and working with political candidates, that we need to encourage a strong primary process. So what I think is going to happen in November is that it's going to kind of shake out in the wash. I mean, I know there are some disenchanted Republicans, and we're waiting to see what they are going to do and whether or not they're going to show up to the polls or sit home. And the same thing goes for the Democrat Party. There are a lot of disenchanted Democrats as well. So it's going to kind of be a battle of bases. And if our base turns out a lot stronger, then we'll be fine. And right now, looking at the polls, it looks like that's going to happen. So I'm interested to see what happens, but there's no secret that both parties are struggling with maintaining a strong base.
Got it. John, what happens to if there's another presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, what happens to the money that Biden has raised so far?
So that money would go, there's a legal dispute about whether it could go directly to a candidate, Harris. That's probably the easiest way to imagine that money being used directly. There is another path it could take, which would mean it would go to the DNC, and then it could also be spent on behalf of that candidate. But for a lot of technical reasons, it's a little bit more difficult than if the main campaign just owns that money itself. So that is something that's giving insider operatives, like Janelle was saying on the Democratic side, some headaches about potential future scenarios. It's definitely easiest if Joe Biden just stays, and then second easiest if it's Kamala.
Got it. Okay. John, how would you sort of describe the political scene right now in the United States? I mean, is there sort of, has it become more polarized, do you think?
It's so interesting. You see Donald Trump, or at least the people loading Donald Trump's teleprompter, recognizing the need to try and find some unity, hit some tones of unity, right? And I think Democrats are also trying to be responsive to the fact that the public thinks Joe Biden is too old for this job, and try and reach out and be responsive to the great mass of American people right now. Right now, on the one hand, it's one of the most tumultuous times that I've lived through in our politics. On the other hand, I think one way or the other, we could come out of this as a stronger nation. We could come out of this in a more united place. That is yet to be seen. We see Donald Trump can maintain the sort of sheen of unity for half an hour. Democrats don't even know who our candidate is. So it's all pretty much up in the air right now.
Janelle, I saw you nodding along to what John had to say. I mean, but if you look at President Trump, a lot of people would say, well, he's not the unifying figure that the United States needs right now.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting perspective that's happening right now, is that whether or not you think he's the unifying figure or not, he is who we have. To their point, is that we don't know what's going to happen on the Democrat side. And I do think that this assassination attempt did bring a lot of people together. I think it put some things in perspective. I think it showed that this is a very serious vote. It's a very serious time. I look at it like we are blessed to live through this period in time, because we're making history. And what we're getting ready to see happen in August with the Democrats is going to be historical, regardless of what happens, because they're deciding whether they want to compete in this race or hand it over to us. And that's where they're standing right now. So I'm interested to see what happens, but I'm looking forward to November.
James, so Janelle was saying that she thinks that the assassination attempt brought people together. But let me ask you, do you think that the assassination attempt actually has an impact on the election and the way that people vote? Because in a nation, as we're saying, that's already deeply divided, you would think that the core vote for either Trump or Biden is pretty much already locked in.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It probably rebounded a little bit, at least temporarily, to Trump's favor, in that, who would not be sympathetic to someone who was the target of an assassination plot and was literally bloodied. But I'm not sure it's going to have impact 2 or 3 months down the road, because we'll have to see how the Republicans counterattack here, not just on the obvious liabilities that Trump again showed, and some of them have to do with just the issue of facts, which we at NewsGuard are involved in. So you can't keep saying that you won the 2020 election. That is a falsehood, an absolute falsehood. The Democrats also have some potential targets with the relatively unknown vice presidential running mate of Trump, namely a 39-year-old senator from Ohio named J.D. Vance, who has sort of modest accomplishments, only been an elected official 2 years. And even though vice presidential candidates generally don't have much impact on a presidential election, it at least would offer whomever might succeed replace Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket with a potential avenue of criticism that might potentially have a little bit of impact on a few of the undecideds, and there seem to be very few.
James, I mean, regardless what happens with Biden, yeah, I'll come to you, Janelle, in just a moment, but let me just continue with James. Regardless of whatever happens with Biden, how do you think the Democrats will come out looking after all of this?
Well, one doesn't know, and it all depends on what happens in Wilmington, Delaware, where Joe Biden is vacationing, and what he decides to do. Right now, they have the challenge of reversing very, very, very negative momentum, a lack of energy, Republicans coming off a pretty raucous and unified convention. So Tell me if he steps down, and I have a better chance of answering that. But again,
all right, well, maybe we will speak as the story develops.
In all these key states.
All right, we'll speak about this as and when the story develops, James. But let me bring in Janelle. Janelle, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just kind of remarking on the statement that, you know, we are as Republicans that we weren't unified, or that are unified momentarily. I do think that this is something that we're going to see a lasting effect. I do think that independents are looking at this from several different angles. I think they're looking at it from the perspective of, hey, you're telling us that President Trump is not that he is the problem, that we should consider him, that he's doing all these things. But then when you see something like an assassination tip, it makes you wonder whether or not that narrative stands true, or if you're being misled. So I do think you have a portion of voters that see it that way. But I also think you have a portion of voters that think that this is being taken a little too seriously.
All right. Final word to John in Colorado. I mean, your thoughts on how this is all going to play out. We have about 45 seconds left.
Oh, none of us know. None of us know, which is what makes this so interesting and exciting. I mean, we could end up with a Trump 2 term with lots of Republicans ready to staff the administration with a very conservative approach and very conservative policies. America could take a hard right turn. Or we could basically get a younger version of, I don't know, somebody who would continue with Joe Biden's policies. So it's a heck of a moment right now, because none of us, you know, we're the experts, but we really don't know.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to my guests. Thanks for joining us, John Neffinger, Janelle King, and James Warren. We really appreciate your time with us. Thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.